In the summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean was a vast and bloody chessboard, scattered with islands whose names would soon be carved into history. Guadalcanal was one of them, a lush, humid, insect-infested island in the Solomon Chain, barely a speck on a map, yet destined to become the pivot of the Pacific War. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was supposed to be a stepping stone. For the Allies, it would become a test of endurance that would define the very fate of the Pacific. When Japan landed construction crews there in July 1942 to build an airfield that would dominate sea routes between the United States and Australia, they had no idea that this seemingly minor island would soon swallow tens of thousands of men and machines in one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II. The Americans struck first. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal, catching the Japanese completely off guard. Within days, they seized the unfinished airfield, renaming it Henderson Field after a fallen pilot from Midway, and began fortifying it under the constant threat of counterattack. The island was thick with jungle and crawling with danger, tropical disease, starvation, and a cunning enemy that would not give up easily. For Tokyo, this loss was an insult and a strategic catastrophe. Henderson Field threatened Japan's entire supply line to the south. To lose Guadalcanal meant losing the initiative in the Pacific. Thus began Japan's desperate effort to retake it, an effort that would require massive logistical operations, convoys of transports, and the courage of countless sailors who would never return. But logistics were the hidden war, the quiet battle behind the thunder of guns. Japan faced a problem no one in the Imperial General Staff could solve: how to supply an army on an island 600 miles from its nearest major base, under constant Allied air superiority. The Japanese called their supply route the Tokyo Express, fast destroyers racing down the slot, a narrow channel between the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness to deliver troops, ammunition, and food. Yet destroyers could only carry so much. When Japan decided to push harder, to send full divisions instead of small reinforcements, they needed bigger vessels, transports. 50 of them were gathered, a vast armada of merchantmen and converted freighters, loaded with men, tanks, and artillery. It was one of Japan's largest logistical gambles of the war. For the Americans on Guadalcanal, life was a mixture of boredom and terror. The Marines endured nightly bombardments, sniper attacks, and deadly raids from the sea. They knew the Japanese were coming in waves, each one stronger than the last. The Navy had already paid dearly at Savo Island and Tassafaronga, where Japanese night tactics and deadly torpedoes had shredded Allied cruisers. But by late 1942, a new weapon began to prowl the waters around Guadalcanal, small, fast, and lethal: the PT boats. They were the mosquito fleet of the U.S. Navy, often dismissed as a novelty, but in the black waters of the Solomons, they would become hunters. The PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, were barely 80 feet long, made mostly of wood, powered by roaring Packard engines that spat flame in the night. They were fragile but fast, capable of 40 knots, armed with 4 torpedoes and a few machine guns. Against a battleship, they stood no chance. Against slow, overloaded transports, they were deadly. Manning these boats were young Americans, barely out of college or high school, men like Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, and later, a young officer named John F. Kennedy. They lived hard, fought dirty, and relied on courage and cunning to survive. They had no armor, no radar in the early days, and sometimes no reliable radio contact. But they had speed, surprise, and the will to fight. By November 1942, Japan was ready for its final, all-out attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal. The Imperial Navy planned to deliver nearly 10,000 troops and heavy equipment in one massive operation. 50 transports were assembled in the northern Solomons, merchant ships, freighters, and converted fishing vessels, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese were determined. They would land their forces or die trying. On paper, it was a bold plan. In practice, it was suicide. U.S. planes from Henderson Field and nearby carriers had grown in number and efficiency. American intelligence had improved, and prowling the narrow waters of Iron Bottom Sound were dozens of PT boats waiting for targets. The stage was set for 2 weeks of chaos, fire, and death on the sea. the transports moved under the cover of darkness, hugging the coastlines, hoping to slip through the Allied net. Each night, the sky was alive with tracer fire and explosions. The PT boats lay in ambush, their crews tense and sweating, listening through the humid silence for the throb of enemy engines. When they struck, it was sudden and violent, roaring engines, blinding flashes, torpedoes hissing into the dark. Japanese ships erupted in flame, men leaping into burning seas, oil slicks spreading across the water. The U.S. Navy called these victories small but vital. Every ship sunk meant fewer supplies, fewer reinforcements, fewer Japanese soldiers reaching the island to fight the Marines. What made the Guadalcanal transport battles unique was their sheer desperation. Japan was throwing everything it had into the island, even as its navy bled dry from months of attrition. Every transport that left Rabaul or Shortland carried not just cargo, but the last hope of saving the Guadalcanal garrison. The PT boats, operating from rough bases like Tulagi and Rendova, faced incredible odds. Constant mechanical breakdowns, lack of spare parts, and tropical diseases that ravaged their crews. Yet they went out every night, often into waters dominated by larger Japanese warships, to intercept convoys many times their size. It was David versus Goliath on the open sea, night after night. By mid-November, the slaughter began. American aircraft bombed the transports by day, forcing the survivors to scatter and hide among the islands. At night, the PT boats hunted the wounded stragglers. Out of 50 Japanese transports sent to Guadalcanal, 38 were destroyed, some by bombs, some by torpedoes, others by the merciless sea itself after being set ablaze. Only a handful managed to reach the shore, and even those were wrecked before unloading fully. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned or burned. Those who reached land found themselves stranded, without food or ammunition, joining the starving remnants of their comrades on the island. Guadalcanal had become a graveyard, not just of men, but of Japan's imperial dreams. The PT boat crews, exhausted and filthy, returned each dawn to their bases, often with splintered hulls and empty fuel tanks. They had fought battles no one saw in darkness and rain against enemies they could barely glimpse. Yet their impact was enormous. By denying Japan the ability to resupply Guadalcanal, they helped turn the tide of the campaign. When the Japanese High Command finally gave up in early 1943 and ordered the evacuation of their remaining troops, the myth of Japanese invincibility at sea was broken. The Empire had met its match, not just in battleships and carriers, but in the courage of men who fought from fragile wooden boats. The story of the 50 transports and the 38 that never returned is more than a tale of naval warfare. It is a reminder of how small things, tiny boats, brave crews, quick decisions, can alter the course of history. The Pacific War was not only fought by grand fleets and famous admirals, but by unsung heroes on dark waters, where victory depended on the will to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. Guadalcanal proved that the tide had turned. The Empire of Japan would never again launch an offensive of that scale. Its dream of domination had sunk beneath the black waters of the Solomons, alongside those 38 transports and the thousands of souls they carried into eternity. When the first U.S. Navy PT boats arrived in the Solomons, few took them seriously. They were small, wooden, and unarmored, barely more than floating engines carrying torpedoes. The big ship admirals saw them as experimental toys, useful perhaps for patrol or message carrying, but hardly as frontline weapons. Yet in the blackness of the South Pacific nights, under the watchful eyes of Japan's destroyers and cruisers, these mosquito boats became one of the most feared forces on the water. They were born from improvisation and necessity, and on the dark seas around Guadalcanal, necessity was the mother of both courage and invention. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy was stretched thin. After months of bitter fighting, it had lost cruisers and destroyers faster than it could replace them. Every battle around Guadalcanal, Savo Island, Cape Esperance, Tassafaronga, had cost dearly. The big ships were constantly under repair or refit, and the nights belonged to the Japanese, who excelled at fast nighttime attacks using the deadly Long Lance torpedo. The Americans needed something small, cheap, and expendable, something that could patrol the narrow channels and strike fast before disappearing into the shadows. That was the world in which the PT boats thrived. Their bases were crude, built from coral and driftwood on tiny islands like Tulagi and Rendova. The crews lived rough, sleeping in hammocks strung under palm trees, fighting mosquitoes, and eating whatever rations hadn't spoiled in the humid heat. But what they lacked in comfort, they made up for in spirit. PT crews were volunteers, drawn by the promise of speed, danger, and independence. They were young men who loved risk, who saw the PT boat not as a death trap but as a challenge. They tinkered with their engines like mechanics, modified their guns, and developed their own tactics in the field. Every night, as the sun sank behind the jungles of Guadalcanal, the crews prepared their boats for patrol. They stripped down, blackened their faces, checked their torpedoes, and tested their twin 50-caliber machine guns. The Packard engines roared to life, echoing across the lagoon. As they slipped into the open sea, the night swallowed them. No lights, no radio chatter, only the pulse of engines and the nervous laughter of men heading into the unknown. Somewhere out there beyond the horizon, Japanese transports were coming. The Japanese, too, had their own kind of bravery. Every transport captain knew the odds. To reach Guadalcanal, they had to run a gauntlet of aircraft by day and PT boats by night. The Imperial Navy's destroyers tried to shield them, blasting away at anything that moved, but the PT boats were elusive. Their wooden hulls made them hard to detect on radar. Their wakes blended with the phosphorescent waves, and when they attacked, it happened in seconds. 4 torpedoes streaking through the dark, followed by the dull boom of explosions, fire, and chaos. In those 2 weeks, the period that would later be remembered as the 2-week inferno, the waters around Guadalcanal turned into a nightmare. Each night, PT squadrons fanned out in small groups of 2 or 3 boats, operating in near silence. They used the glow of burning ships from previous battles to navigate. Sometimes they ambushed convoys at close range, firing torpedoes from less than 1,000 yards. Other times, they chased retreating ships, peppering them with machine gun fire until explosions tore the darkness apart. It was madness, but it worked. On November 13th, the Japanese launched one of their largest efforts yet. The convoy included over a dozen transports escorted by destroyers and light cruisers, all loaded with reinforcements bound for Guadalcanal. They set out under moonlight, hoping to make a fast dash through the slot. But American reconnaissance spotted them, and by dawn, aircraft from Henderson Field were already in the air. Dive bombers and torpedo planes struck mercilessly, setting several transports ablaze. Those that survived limped onward, determined to reach the island before nightfall. That night, the PT boats went hunting. As the surviving Japanese ships crept along the coast, the sea erupted with light and sound. PT-59 and PT-45, under the command of Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, closed in at high speed, their engines screaming. Through the spray, they fired torpedoes that streaked like comets across the dark. One transport exploded amidships, breaking apart in a plume of orange flame. The concussion rocked the tiny boats, sending waves over their decks. The crews cheered, one more ship gone. But their victory was short-lived. Japanese destroyers opened fire, their tracers slicing the night sky. The PT boats darted and weaved, barely escaping, bullets punching holes through their thin hulls. Every night brought new engagements. Some PT boats never returned, vanishing in explosions or swallowed by the sea. Others limped back with holes patched by tin plates and planks, yet the tally kept climbing. Within days, 10, then 20, then 30 transports were gone. Each sinking meant hundreds of Japanese soldiers lost, men who would never reach the island, supplies that would never feed the starving troops fighting for survival on Guadalcanal. By the end of the second week, 38 of the 50 transports had been destroyed. The cost to the Japanese was catastrophic. The ocean became a graveyard of burning wrecks and drifting corpses. Oil fires burned for days, casting a haunting glow over the sea. Survivors clung to debris, their cries echoing across the water. American PT crews sometimes pulled Japanese sailors from the waves, but more often they had to move on. Orders were orders, and rescue meant exposure. Those who reached the shores of Guadalcanal found themselves stranded, cut off from resupply, doomed to starvation or disease. Behind every victory, however, was the shadow of exhaustion. The PT men were running on nerves and adrenaline. They fought with little sleep, often drenched, bitten by insects, and sick from malaria. The tropical storms soaked their gear and rusted their weapons. When they returned to base, their boats were riddled with holes, engines sputtering, fuel tanks nearly dry. Yet before nightfall, they'd be back out again, driven by something greater than orders. A sense that they were holding the line, that their small victories were turning the tide of an entire war. The Japanese high command refused to believe the scale of the disaster at first. Reports trickled in: missing convoys, lost ships, broken communications. They sent more transports, more destroyers to escort them, but it was like feeding men into a furnace. American aircraft and PT boats hunted them relentlessly. The Japanese destroyers that survived were forced to abandon escort duty to fight elsewhere, leaving the transports defenseless. Tokyo's dream of reclaiming Guadalcanal was dying, one ship at a time. The PT boats' success was not just in their torpedo hits, but in the psychological toll they inflicted. Japanese sailors came to fear the sound of their engines, the deep growl of Packards that signaled death in the night. Convoy commanders altered routes, slowed down, or even turned back, knowing that the Americans were waiting. In a war where logistics often decided victory, the PT boats became a weapon of starvation. They strangled Japan's supply line to Guadalcanal, turning every voyage into a suicide mission. By the end of the campaign, when the Japanese finally ordered evacuation, the PT boats had proven themselves beyond doubt. Once dismissed as expendable, they had become essential. They had sunk or helped sink dozens of enemy ships, saved downed pilots, and harassed the enemy so effectively that even the mighty Imperial Navy struggled to operate freely. Their actions were small on a map, but monumental in consequence. For the men who fought in those boats, the memories never faded. They could still smell the burning oil, hear the screams over the radio, and see the flickering flames on the horizon. Many were just boys, but in those nights they became hardened veterans. The camaraderie among PT crews was unbreakable. They relied on each other completely, knowing that one mistake could mean death for all. They fought without the glory of big battleships, without the press headlines that followed carrier pilots, but history would later recognize their courage. When historians look back on Guadalcanal, they often focus on the grand strategies, the airfield, the marine assaults, the carrier battles. But beneath those headlines lies this untold story of men in small wooden boats facing overwhelming odds, shaping the outcome of a campaign with their grit and ingenuity. The 2-week inferno was not just a naval episode, it was a microcosm of the entire Pacific War, a battle of endurance, innovation, and sheer willpower. The PT boats had changed the rhythm of the war. They proved that in modern conflict, speed and surprise could outweigh size and armor. And more importantly, they showed that courage wasn't measured in tons of steel or rank insignia. It was measured in the hearts of those who went out into the dark, knowing they might never return. As the flames of the sun rose again over the Solomon Sea, the water still shimmered with the oil of burning ships. The smell of death lingered, carried on the wind. The sea had claimed its price, but the island stood free. Guadalcanal, once an obscure jungle outpost, had become the grave of Japan's southern ambitions. And the small, swift PT boats, those wooden warriors of the night, had helped write that destiny in fire and salt water. When the smoke cleared over Guadalcanal, Japan's grand gamble lay shattered beneath the waves. Of the 50 transports that set sail, 38 never made it home. Thousands of men and tons of equipment were lost to the sea. The Imperial Navy's confidence cracked. Their supply lines lay in ruins. The PT boats, once underestimated, had proven decisive. In just 2 weeks, they helped cripple Japan's Pacific advance, forcing the enemy into retreat. The ocean that had once carried Japan might now carried only wreckage, flaming reminders of an empire beginning to crumble beneath its own ambition. The battle for Guadalcanal changed everything. It marked the moment when Japan's unstoppable advance met an immovable resistance. The PT boats, small yet fearless, became symbols of ingenuity and courage, proving that victory depended not on size but on spirit and strategy. Their success inspired new naval tactics and reshaped the future of maritime warfare. For Japan, Guadalcanal was the beginning of the long retreat. For the Allies, it was the dawn of hope in the Pacific. The wrecks that still rest beneath those waters whisper the story of sacrifice, courage, and the night the tide truly turned.